to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. With that, I move on to item number 3. Do we have any citizens? There are no citizens for citizens' comment. With that, we move to item 4. Following items for discussion and consideration and action, discuss and draft proposed city charter. With that, I'll turn it over to you, Charlie, and you have the floor.
Thank you. All right. Yeah, it's definitely on now. I believe all of y'all got a copy of what I drafted from the previous meeting. Mr. Hawley was kind enough to point out one change that we need to make under 3.04B, where I use the term president pro tempore instead of mayor, so I'll change that to mayor. Don't worry about any minor, that's a important, I mean, not substantive, but certainly form. Don't worry about any spelling issues between the city secretary and myself, and city administrator. We'll make sure we get those sorted out. But from a substantive standpoint, all of these are the changes that were, not the changes, sorry, are the provisions, I believe, as approved. Section 3.03, we're going to hold off on finalizing until we get to 5.02, which is the qualifications. And then if you notice in section 3.04, this is on page 3, line 9, in discussions about when to appoint the mayor pro tem, I think this is consistent with what was discussed at each new council's first meeting or as soon as practical, which I think is consistent with how we do it now. I included very specifically that the mayor pro tempore acts as the mayor in the disability or absence of the mayor, but made very clear, because sometimes this comes up, believe it or not, that the city council member who acts in the capacity of the mayor in the mayor's absence does not lose their right to vote. They're still a voting member of city council. So I added that, which I don't think was discussed. And then finally, if you notice, I added the section regarding the mayor's veto that we discussed in section 311. We have not yet discussed section 311, but I believed it was the most appropriate place to add it because 311 deals with the passage of ordinances, and that's where the mayor's veto or right to, require reconsideration would come up, is during the passage of ordinances. The other thing that I did is I've highlighted there because all we really discussed was the passage of ordinances. And I highlighted ordinance or resolution so I could get some input as to whether or not this body believes that the mayor's right of reconsideration should be limited to legislative actions, which is what an ordinance is, or also to administrative actions, which is what a resolution is. So I thought I should bring that before you for your debate and discussion. So that's really the only outstanding item, unless somebody else has something within here that they believed was inconsistent with what was approved.
Do any of the commissioners have anything they want to bring up at this time on this? There is one question we had on item 311C. It talks about reading the caption in its entirety. Why would that be required, or is that just, is there a legal requirement to read, or?
No, there isn't. That's and again, we didn't read 311, so I just recopied 311 exactly as it was, okay. And included the provisions for the mayor's veto. When we get to 311, we can discuss that broader, but there is no legal reason why that's in there. That's just something that they wanted to make sure happened. It's not required under the law.
Do you want to discuss the ordinance or resolution at this time, or you want to hold off?
I think since it was part of the broader veto, which was approved, I think we should probably do that now, and then make sure we get that set in stone, and then we can start on section 305 after that.
I'm going to ask the mayor if he has any input on that particular aspect.
I think that's actually a good idea. that you include resolution in there. I have no problem with that.
Commission, do you have any disagreement with that?
I don't have a problem with it myself, but could you go over you made a distinction between ordinance versus resolution?
Right. Yes, so an ordinance is the laying down of a law. In other words, we're adopting some law. A resolution is just giving action, just giving direction, typically. And I will say there's a big loophole in here when it says resolution, because anything you can do by resolution, you can do by motion and action. So you could actually avoid the resolution issue just by simply making a motion to do something, unless you require it to be done by resolution somewhere else. So, for example, I have some cities, because they prefer to have a better paper trail than just minutes, will create a resolution authorizing the city manager to sign a contract. Because that's not an ordinance, that's a resolution, that's an administrative action, giving direction to the city manager, approving the contract, but regardless of what that contract may be, whatever. And so I've got clients that do that by resolution, and they actually have an ordinance in place that requires that to be done by resolution. Because they prefer that resolution paper trail, as opposed to a motion authorizing the city manager to execute the contract with a second and a vote, and then it being recorded in the minutes. That's just a preference that they have. But an ordinance is a legislative action. A resolution is typically an administrative action, giving direction for something, whatever it may happen to be. Anything that you can do by motion, you can do by resolution. Anything that you can do by resolution, you can do by motion, unless state law dictates that it has to be done by resolution. And there are some, I just can't think of them off the top of my head.
But that was one of the powers the mayor would have, is he would be able to, or the mayor would be able to do something by resolution or by ordinance.
The mayor would have no authority to do anything by resolution, but if we include the word resolution in here, the mayor would have the authority to require the city council to reconsider the adoption of any resolution if we leave that language in here. I will state, though, there is a huge loophole, which is city council could choose just to do it by motion and action, then it would not be a resolution and it would not be subject to reconsideration. So really the resolution would only be subject to city council wanting to give the mayor that by conscious decision-making, the ability to require reconsideration, or if there's some provision in state law that requires something to be done by resolution, if that makes any sense.
But as it's written here, the mayor would not have the authority to handle that with a motion. I mean, to handle a motion.
Right, so let's make it let's just put a hypothetical in the air, all right? City council decides, or the city manager comes to city council and says, I need authority to finalize this development agreement with this developer. That's a big example, right? And it's the execution of a contract. And city council if a city council gives that authority to sign the contract by resolution, in other words, if we draft a resolution, we create findings, and the resolution says, here be it resolved, the city manager has authority to execute the development agreement attached here to as Exhibit A, the mayor would then have authority to require that to be reconsidered, all right, under the process that's listed in here. But under the law, city council is not required to adopt a resolution to give that direction. City council could just say, I move to authorize the city manager to execute the development agreement. If it's done that way by city council, the mayor would not have the authority to require the reconsideration of that issue. Now, that's a bigger issue, right? That's a development agreement. But I have a city council who requires all contracts to be approved and authorized to be executed by resolution. Everything from a contract to buy pencils to a development agreement or an incentive agreement. So I hope I made that clear. There's a choice.
Yeah.
City council, unless state law dictates otherwise, city council has a choice to give direction or take action in the administrative realm, either by resolution or by a motion and minute order. Those are equal. One's just more formal than the other.
How would that actually work in the case of a motion to give the mayor that ability?
Well, if you wanted to give the mayor the authority to block anything that city council does, whether it be administrative or legislative, you would have to include language that says, before an ordinance, resolution, or other action taken by city council may be approved, you'd have to delay that, right? I'd have to figure out a way, because I've never drafted that before. I've never had that in a veto action before. But because a motion to approve something and a resolution, a motion to approve something is immediately. As soon as it's done,
Right.
all right? In the form of a resolution, if this language is in here, it would be acted upon in the same way that an ordinance is, right? It would have to go to the city secretary's office, placed in the city secretary's office. The mayor would have a certain amount of time, however many days we put in here, I think 3 days, to object, right? But when it's by motion, it's done.
Mayor, Nancy, what's your take on this?
So Nancy, can I jump in first on that one? Sure. So we do resolutions all the time. And sometimes they are in the consent agenda. Like just last Wednesday, we had a resolution within the consent agenda to grant you the authority to act on the city's behalf to execute the contract for the acreage, the purchase of the acreage that's adjacent to Paul Davis Park, which is a huge win for the city of Garden Ridge, by the way. We could have pulled that from the consent agenda to talk about it, still pass the rest of the consent agenda in the interest of time, and then discuss the resolution at length. And then if it's something that I wasn't happy with as the mayor, then that would be another process of checks and balances that we could use, that if the council passed that with a majority vote to grant the city manager, in this case, the authority to act on behalf of the city and the city council to execute this contract, then if I disagree with that as the mayor, then I'd have my 4 days to say, hey, we need to relook at this. So we're going to most likely talk a little bit later on today about checks and balances and what we put into this draft charter commission, our constitution, to provide those checks and balances to protect the city of Garden Ridge when we are not as fortunate as we are right now with a council that works very well together, a city staff that works very well with the city council and the department heads and everything. I'm not saying it's always kumbaya in the city of Garden Ridge, but we're very, very fortunate that everything works as well as it does right now. And people are very kind and we get along. It doesn't mean we agree on everything, but we keep the process going. Not every city is like that right now. And unfortunately, we can't guarantee that the city of Garden Ridge will always be that way. So although we hope that's the case, but we got to plan for it not to be. So this is just one more small check and balance that we can put in there to still have the mayor looking out for the best interests of the city if he or she disagrees with the resolution. So I think this is a good thing. So we have a resolution that that will be on the agenda for January, giving Nancy authority to execute our investment plan, our portfolio, if you will, for the city of Garden Ridge. If the council approves that, but I didn't think that was the best thing in the best interest of the city of Garden Ridge, then this would give me the ability within 4 days to go, hey, I think we need to relook at this. So those are a couple examples. I'm not, my opinion, I'm not hard over either way, but I think it's one more thing we can have in there just to help protect the city. Nancy?
What I'd like to add is often that we do have resolutions come before council. Some of the programs that we participate in, or say, for instance, if we were to accept a grant or file for a grant of some sort, those things are going to require resolutions. Some of those things have a monetary interest in them, so I think the keeping resolution in here is a good move, a good check and balance.
Any thoughts from the commission?
What are your thoughts, Nancy and Rob, on providing that same protection to motions? Because I think that's the issue here, is whether we ought to include it for motions or not.
And that would be, just so everybody knows, that would be a step beyond what you currently do. I don't know a city in the state of Texas that does that.
That answers.
I think we just answered that question,
Okay.
but it's a good question, Wayne, thanks.
So do I have a motion to accept this wording about ordinance or resolution in paragraph 311D1?
I move that it's accepted the way it's written, as he's written it, I should say.
Motion, do I have a second?
Second?
Any further discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries.
Great.
Okay, Charlie.
Thank you very much. And then I'll make that change, Mr. Hawley, with respect to the president as opposed to mayor. All right. So next is, we left off at section 3.05. 3.05 deals with vacancies, forfeitures of office, and filling of vacancies. The first section, Section A, is very boilerplate. It basically says that the office of council member or mayor is vacated on their death, resignation, forfeiture of office, or removal from office by any manner authorized by law. Very, very boilerplate. B is some substantive issues. First, a member of council shall forfeit their office if they cease to possess the required qualifications for that office. And that typically means, I don't know what it means. It usually means if they get convicted of a felony or something like that, and they lose that qualification. But that's, I think they actually specifically listed that in here as one of them. But anyway, in case some new thing comes up in the state law that requires forfeiture, this covers it. Two, if they're convicted of a felony or of a misdemeanor involving moral turpitude, that's not in the state law. That's something that a lot of cities put into their charter because there are very specifically listed crimes that are not felonies, that are crimes of moral turpitude, and you can look them up and see whether or not they are. And then, so that would be a removal that's unique to the Home Rule Charter. If they are convicted of violating any state laws regulating conflicts of interest of municipal officers, that is, I think that's repetitive. I meant to look at that before I come over and I forgot. I think that's repetitive of state law. I believe the conflict of interest laws provision of the state of Texas say if that you violate them, that you forfeit your office. But it's definitely in this charter. If you cease to be a resident of the city, that's actually a big one. If you look at state law, there is nothing in state law that requires you to continue to be a resident of the city. It just requires you to have resided in the city for a period of time. It doesn't require you to continue to reside in the city limits. And so this is put in there for that purpose. And then C basic says that every forfeiture shall be declared and enforced by the city council. What that means is, for purposes of definity, something, for example, if a council member was convicted of a felony, then that issue would be brought to city council. City council would recognize that issue, would recognize that they were convicted of a felony, adopt adopt a motion, a resolution indicating that that was the case and removing that council member from office, taking definitive action. And then D is, the way it's currently drafted is not applicable. I would recommend drafting different language because this is applicable only to a city that has 3-year terms. And that's how a council member is replaced. And if you want to remain consistent with the state law, the way a council member would be replaced is either appointing a council member or having a special election to fill the vacancy. In state law, if there's 2 or more vacancies, then you have to hold, at the same time, then you have to hold a special election. So if we were going to be consistent with the current process, that's what you would do. You could either appoint, hold a special election, or if there's 2 or more vacancies at the same time, hold a special election. And we can get to that, so.
Do we need to stipulate that in the charter, or is that something that's already covered?
We
by
would need to
state?
stipulate that in the charter. And I'm going to find the state law provision. So, I now turn it over to you.
So we would basically be looking at approving or considering Section 305 in its entirety with the appropriate rewording to Section D to accommodate the fact that we have 2-year terms.
Yeah, and yes, that's right. If you're comfortable with all of B, then I would come up with some language for D to be consistent with state law.
Is there any discussion from the commission on this language? Anything you would like, Liz?
Yes, I have a thought about one other thing we want to put into Section B about if there's excessive absence from meetings. Do we feel like, I mean, it may not be an issue now, but in the future, if you have a council member who's not present, say 3 council meetings or more?
How do other cities handle that with regard to vacancies? I know when Andrew went out, we made some sort of a motion or something, resolution or something, basically saying that he was still in office even though he was taking a long-term leave of absence to accommodate his health. How do other cities handle absences?
So it just varies from city to city, anywhere from it's not addressed to if you miss 3 consecutive regular council meetings, it's considered a forfeiture of office unless an appropriate excused absence was given by city council. So it really is a broad spectrum of
Mayor, do you have any kind of thoughts on that regarding attendance?
Nancy, you've been here 20 years. Has that ever come up, other than Andrew Dalton?
Just Andrew.
Okay. It was something that when we authored and then passed our ethics ordinance in April, this past April, we didn't have any language in there regarding that. I don't think we could under general law type A. Is that right, Charlie?
right.
Yeah, that was one of the things that we looked at in our ethics ordinance, which has a lot of the same commonalities in it, but as a general law type A, we don't have as much authority to take action on things with elected officials as you do in a home rule charter. So I think, Liz, it's a really good question and it's a good comment. Maybe it's one of those things that we don't specify, and then in 2 years, when and if it passes on the ballot, we come back and look at it. That's something that we could address to maybe add back in there. So how many, Charlie, what's your thoughts on that? I mean, do a lot of cities do it, or they just leave it not addressed?
Yeah, I don't know. I can't give you any math on it, but it really is a spectrum of different.
So
If I had to guess, it may be
if we reverse the
50-50.
situation and don't put any language in there because we haven't had it happen in 20 years and don't expect it, but then it did happen. How is that handled under current process?
Well, the way we would handle it now, I mean, when, just like Nadine did at the beginning of the commission, she said all of our commissioners are present and accounted for. We had a council member miss last week's council meeting, and it was because he had the flu, so he can't be there. And I said, hey, we have council member from place one isn't here. He's homesick with the flu with his kids, and we don't want him here right now, but he's watching online, which he did. If excessive and consecutive, actually, if just absences became a factor with the current council right now, it's something that, and Nancy and I have talked about this, it's something that we would address with that council member to say, hey, are we missing something? What's going on? You've missed a lot of these meetings. It's very important to be present at these meetings, if for no other reason, to vote and exercise your vote as an elected official, but also when we go into recess and then reconvene in executive session to talk about things that legally either are attorney-client privilege, or we can legally, they're not ready to go public yet as we look into the situation to seek advice with our counsel. That's something we can't talk about out of executive session. So that's something that you miss. But the way that we would handle it is talk to them, and if it's something that became an issue, then I would, with Nancy, we'd come up with a solution, and that could be, we've had members with health reasons resign from council. And then we have appointed, and that's how I got on council back in March of 2017, was when council member Shelby Trial was having some health issues. He decided to take a step back, and then the council appointed Rob Erickson in there. So that's how I would handle it right now.
And here's, just so, I'm sorry, I
No,
kind of
no.
get the feeling you finished up. I just wanted to read to you what the law currently says, which is what, they handle it based on what the law says, but I thought I'd read you what the law says. If a member of the governing body is absent for 3 regular consecutive meetings, the member's office is considered vacant unless the member is sick or has first obtained a leave of absence at a regular meeting. So if they're sick, then that doesn't count. Or if they know they're going to go somewhere and they get a leave of absence first, that doesn't count. Second, or C, in addition to an absence described by subsection B, a member of a governing body is also considered absent for the purposes of that subsection if the member is not present at the adjournment of a meeting at which a quorum is established, unless the member is first allowed to withdraw by unanimous vote of the members present. That subsection applies only to a municipality that is located in a county with a population of 800,000 or more and adjacent to the international border. My guess is that's a bracketed legislation. My guess is that there is a general law city there that had a real problem with council members breaking quorum by leaving the meeting because they didn't want to discuss a particular item on the agenda. So they broke quorum when they came to that agenda item, but they were present for when the meeting started, so they probably did that multiple meetings in a row, but weren't considered absent, 3 meetings in a row, because they were there. So my guess is that's, and the only reason I say that is because I'm actually dealing with that with another client right now, where I have some council members breaking quorum. But it's not in this county, for sure. So that's what the state law says.
So the state law generally covers
Only for, I'm sorry, that's type A general law
Okay.
cities.
Okay.
State law doesn't address home rule cities. That's why we need to put it in the charter.
So do we want to bring some of that language from type A general law city over into this charter?
So was any of that information or that type information used in ordinance 210? I believe it was, about how many absences you could have, things of that nature.
You're talking ordinance 210, the commission ordinance. I thought we took that out, and we also took out the you have to attend 2 council meetings every year, and so we took all that out, so.
Do you need to put it back?
Yeah. So to be clear, the only section that currently applies to the city of Garden Ridge is if a member of the governing body is absent for 3 regular consecutive meetings, the member's office is considered vacant unless the member is sick or has first obtained a leave of absence at a regular meeting. Note that there is no other action necessary to be required by city council to effectuate that. If they miss 3 consecutive meetings, they're out. It's an automatic forfeiture of office. The way this home rule charter is drafted, it's not automatic. They have vacated their office, but city council has to actually declare the forfeiture. Does that make sense?
So in other words, if we brought that language over, the council would still need to declare.
Right, right. So if they miss, upon the 3rd missing of the meeting, the next meeting, they would have to declare the vacancy and then fill it in whatever manner they choose to fill it.
I think you leave it as is.
I would
That gives-
agree.
That gives
after
the city
hearing-
council the flexibility that they have now.
After hearing the discussion, we've already got a check and balance in that we elect every 2 years. You know, and Mayor, you already said, if it becomes an issue, it can be readdressed at a later date and added to a charter. So instead of bogging down into weeds that are not even growing right now and haven't grown for 20 years, I would also offer to the commission, let's not add something that we don't need. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. We don't expect that it's going to be an issue, but we have a tool in the hands of this city to put it in if we need it at a later date and it becomes an issue.
So, do I have a motion? I have, what I'm understanding, Jimmy, your motion is basically do not put any language with regard to absences in the charter. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay.
Based on what I heard, in my opinion, I don't think we need to add. I think it was a great point, but I think, well, I stated what I felt.
Okay. So I have a motion. Do I have a second? Motion.
A second.
Motion and a second. Any further discussion on this issue? All those in favor of leaving the wording out of section 305, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? We have one in opposition, but the motion still carries. So we do have the rest of 305.
And the only remaining issue, if everybody's comfortable with all, the other sections, is how do we fill a vacancy? And it might be a good idea just to fill that vacancy consistent with how you do it under general law city, because you're not changing your terms of office. So let me read that to you. This is going to be found in 22.010 of the local government code. If for any reason a single vacancy exists on the governing body of the municipality, a majority of the remaining members who are present and voting, excluding the mayor, may fill the vacancy by appointment unless an election to fill the vacancy is required by Section 11, Article 11 of the Texas Constitution. I would leave that language out because that language addresses 3-year terms. You'll have 2-year terms, so it's not going to be applicable. The mayor may vote on the appointment only if there is a tie. Second, a person serving as a member of the governing body is not, because of that service, ineligible to be appointed to fill a vacancy in the office of mayor of the municipality, but the person may not vote on the person's own appointment. 3, the person appointed to fill the vacancy serves until the next regular municipal election. What does that mean? It means if somebody's elected in May and they leave city council in June, for whatever reason, that if they are appointed, they will only serve until the next May when a special election would be held to fill that vacancy for the remainder of the term. Does that make sense? And that's going to be true regardless of when they're appointed. So if If they're elected in May and they leave council in December, same thing. If they're appointed in January, they will only serve until May when a special election is held. So, does that make sense? The next one is, in lieu of appointing a person to fill a vacancy on the governing body, a special election may be ordered to elect a person to fill the vacancy. If two or more vacancies on the governing body exist at the same time, a special election shall be ordered to fill the vacancies. And this was newly added in 2017. A member of the governing body is ineligible to vote to fill a vacancy on the governing body by special election after resigning from the governing body. And finally, if a vacancy, this would not be applicable because we're only having elections for council. So D1 essentially means that somebody can't, because the law says that if you resign from city council, under the Texas Constitution, you actually hold over in office and you continue to perform your response, you're supposed to, under the Constitution, continue to perform the functions of your office until that office is filled. So this was put in place, my guess, I haven't read the legislative backup, but after doing this for a long time, my guess, because I've seen all the trickery, my guess is this is to prevent somebody from resigning from office and then voting to fill their own vacancy with them to create a majority, because I've seen that happen. You got a majority of three, and so 2 and 2, right? The mayor there's a majority, there's 2 council members who don't get along with these 3, but they get along really well with the mayor, right? So one of these people resigns, so now it's 2 and 2, and this person, these 2 want to make sure they maintain the same majority over these 2, so he resigns and then he votes on his own appointment, right? So that now they continue the same majority. That's probably why that was put in place, to prevent that from happening. So I'm happy to read it again, but that's the current law. And what I would do if you're in favor of that is just take that language and plug it in to our charter.
Mayor, do you have any issues with that? I mean, that's basically what we followed previously.
Yeah, that sounded a lot like how I got onto council and how with you, right? And the way we conduct business right now. So I think everything that Charlie just said with the law, I'm good with. So, Nancy?
Jim?
But Charlie, you said earlier, you just said that's the language that's in the current law, correct?
Yes, sir.
Well, I thought we had talked the last meeting that we weren't just going to regurgitate what's already in the law in a charter, that it's already covered in the law, therefore why rewrite it into the charter?
Great question.
Am I missing something?
Yeah, you are, and that's because I have failed to communicate. This is currently state law for a type A general law city. And there is no state law for home rule.
So commissioners, what's your feeling with regard to the language for filling a vacancy? Are you satisfied with staying with type A general law city wording and having Charlie incorporate that?
I am.
Okay. Well, then what I'd like to do is if there's nothing else further you think should go in 305, get a motion to approve 305 to include the wording about replacement and to eliminate paragraph D, right? Eliminating D?
Yes, ma'am, and replacing it with the language found in section 22.010 of the Texas Local Government Code.
Yes, thank you. Do I have a motion to that effect? I have a motion. Do I have a second?
Second.
Motion and a second. Any further discussion in 3.05 as adjusted? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carried. Charlie?
Thank you. Section 3.06 is boilerplate language. All powers of the city and determination of all matters of policy shall be vested in the city council, except where in conflict with and otherwise expressly provided by this charter. The city council shall have all the powers authorized to be exercised by the Constitution and laws of the United States and the state of Texas.
Any discussion from the commission? If not, may I have a motion on,
I got
Yes,
one thought.
sorry, Janelle.
It's boilerplate, but in the beginning, in your other writings here, you talk about everything that we're doing is going to be under the laws of the state of Texas. This is the first mention of the United States.
Yeah, sure. It's pretty, we could take out a United States, but it clearly applies. We can't violate the United States Constitution.
It does, I'm just saying it.
I have no issue. This was, I'm happy to take, I have no pride of ownership
No,
or
I'm just saying
authorship.
It's just a point of order, you
Yeah.
didn't put it in the first part, and now you're
No.
gonna throw it in, and it's like, it just shows up, and it isn't mentioned anywhere else.
Yeah. Happy
It's just
to
a
handle it.
anybody have any thoughts on that issue? Do I have a motion with regards to 3.06?
I'll make a motion, we approve 306 as written.
I have a motion to approve. Do I have a second?
I second.
Motion and a second. Any further discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries.
3.07 deals with specific prohibitions on council and council members. Starting with A, except where authorized by law or by this charter, no mayor or council member shall hold any other city office or city employment during his or her term as mayor or council member. Second sentence, no former mayor or council member shall hold any compensated appointed office or city employment until 1 year after the expiration of the term for which they were elected or appointed to city council. This section essentially requires city council to stay out of any other appointed issue that is city appointed, and then prohibits them from becoming a city employee or other paid compensated appointed office, say for example, city attorney, until at least 1 year after they've been removed from council.
So, for example, we contract out our building inspection. They're not a city employee because they're not actually an employee, but they are a subcontract or a contractor.
That would be okay, because
That
it's
would
not an office and it's not employment. That would be okay.
Okay.
This says specifically any compensated appointed office. So city attorney is an appointed office, municipal prosecutor is going to be an appointed office, municipal judge is going to be an appointed office. So it would prohibit those. City manager, you couldn't then be an employee. So that's all this talks about. You could still leave council and become a subcontractor for some service, whatever that may happen to be. You just could not be in an appointed office or an employee for a period of 1 year.
Mayor, Nancy, do you have any input on this before we turn it over to the commission?
Now that I understand what the compensated appointed office means, I'm good with this as it's written.
Do I have any thoughts from the commission relative to this, section A?
Does anyone consider 1 year to be too long?
I find that interesting, just as an aside, most people ask if it's too short.
That's about it.
And that's not a comment on what it should be. I've never heard that comment before.
Well, and the only reason I said that is simply because maybe there was somebody that was, let's say, a council member. They got on the council, they got off the council, and then all of a sudden we realized that they had an expertise about law, and we needed somebody to support the lawyer as he is, and so now we hire him. Well, we can't. That's all, but that's all I got.
We
Jim?
can contract him, we just can't hire him. We could contract that person, is what I'm understanding.
Yeah,
We just can't put him on the city payroll.
Right, and they couldn't be in an office. So using your example of expertise in the law that would be helpful, So for example, this would prohibit the council from, within a one-year time period, terminating the services of whoever the city attorney is at that period in time, and then immediately appointing that council member into the office of city attorney. It would, using our firm as the example, it would also prohibit us from hiring that person as a lawyer to join the firm, and then having them serve as an assistant city attorney to the city of Garden Ridge. We could still hire them, they just couldn't serve the city of Garden Ridge. This is really intended to prohibit the council or a council member from taking advantage of their position on council and being immediately inserted into employment using using leverage for purposes of personal gain. It's intended to put a cool-off period between the resignation and any hiring. And honestly, the most I ever hear it is, it's not city attorney, it's city manager. It's a concern that some council member and council may decide that they want a council member to be the city manager, and they want to make sure they have that cooling off period before that can ever occur.
Interesting. Thank you.
Any further discussion on Section A? So do I have a motion to approve Section A as written? Or otherwise? I have a motion on Section A.
I move that we approve Section A as written.
I have a motion. Do I have a second?
I'll second.
Motion and second. Any further discussion? All in favor say aye.
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 Any opposed? Motion carries.
Section B is intended to ensure that the form of government that you have adopted is pure. B says, members of the city council shall not in any way dictate the appointment or removal of the city administrative officers, employees appointed by the city manager or any of the city manager's subordinates. The city council at a meeting called for that purpose may express its views fully and freely and discuss with the city manager anything pertaining to the appointment and removal of such officers' employees. Essentially, this says city council needs to stay out of the business of the city manager running the day-to-day operation and hiring the appropriate individuals that work for the city manager. This does not prohibit the city council from expressing its views. We think the Public Works Department director is terrible and is not doing their job, but it would prohibit the council or an individual member of council from dictating to the city manager that that person be fired.
I think we had a question and discussion about the city council at a meeting called for that purpose. That doesn't have to be a special meeting, does it? It could be an item on the agenda of a regular meeting.
Yeah, I don't interpret this to mean that it has to be a meeting with only that on the agenda. It could have multiple things on the agenda, including this as an agenda item.
Do I have any discussion from the commission on this item? Do I have a motion relative to paragraph B?
I move we accept it as written.
I have a motion. Do I have a second?
I second it.
Motion and a second. Any further discussion? All in,
Aye.
any opposed? Motion carried.
Can I ask one little tweak to this? I have never interpreted it the way, this language, the way, that this has to be a special meeting for that purpose only. But the fact that you looked at it and thought that was a possibility, concerns me. Because my interpretation would be no, you can just be an agenda item, right? Because that said, I hope I'm your lawyer until I retire, right? But we may not be. So I would prefer, I think, if we said the city council at a meeting called in compliance with the Texas Open Meetings Act. Would that be okay with everybody if we made that change?
Yes, that's fine. We'll take that change by consensus.
Thank you. That way we will eliminate that concern. And I just learned something today. C is, except for the purposes of inquiries and investigation as provided by this charter, members of the city council shall interact with the city officers and employees who are subject to direction and supervision of the city manager solely through the city manager. Neither members of the city council nor the city council shall give orders to any such officer or employees, either publicly or privately, except as otherwise provided in the charter. This prevents city council and individual council members from going to the poor guy or gal who's digging the ditch in the park and telling them to stop digging that ditch in the park and go fill that pothole on my street. That's essentially what it does.
Any discussion from the commission? Do I have a motion relative to this paragraph?
I make a motion, we accept it as written.
Motion, do I have a second? Motion and a second. Any further discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries.
Thank you. 308, meetings of council. The city council shall hold such monthly meetings as necessary to efficiently conduct the affairs of the city. Period. The city council shall set the date and time of its regular meetings by resolution. So this is one of those provisions that it would have to be set by resolution as required by the charter.
Do I have a motion on this paragraph?
Move we accept it as written.
Motion to accept, second? I have a motion and a second. Any further discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carried.
Thank you. Section 309 dictates a quorum. So let me read this first sentence. 4 members of the city council shall constitute a quorum for the purposes of transaction of business. Note that it's 4 because in this particular charter, if you remember, they gave the mayor the right to vote, so it made 6 voting members. That's why a quorum is 4. That's a majority of 6. So in this case, consistent with the general laws of the state, 3 would be a quorum. So I would certainly recommend, unless you want a supermajority for a quorum at all times, which could be problematic, it would be 3 members of the city council shall constitute a quorum for purposes of the transaction of business. No action of the city council, except as specifically provided in this charter, shall be valid or binding unless adopted by the affirmative vote, a majority of present and qualified to act. So this is a present and voting provision. So if there are 3 people, a vote of 2 would adopt an act. That's the way this is drafted. If there's 3 voting members present.
Nancy, you have comment?
I have a question.
Yes, ma'am.
Is this just for regular meetings, or is this for both regular and special?
This would be for both regular and special.
Wow,
Because type A general law is the only city that requires a supermajority for,
okay.
I didn't know that.
We like that.
To elaborate on that, when we get into budget season and we have to get everything approved and whatnot, we run into, during the summer months, vacations, and it's hard sometimes to work schedules to schedule these special budget meetings for a supermajority required currently by general law type A. So that explains why Nancy and I and Marissa are like, the council are like, yeah, that sounds great.
for context, a general law city, a quorum is 3 for a regular meeting, and if it's a special meeting, a quorum, so you have to have at least 4 for a special meeting. And so that does become, that is consistent with all of my type A general law cities during budget season, because oftentimes special meetings have to be held, and trying to organize that with vacations and such becomes difficult.
Are proxies ever allowed for the council members?
No, ma'am.
No.
It's 3 members plus the mayor.
No, 3 members. 3 members. 3 members, period. Mayor doesn't have to be there. Yeah. The mayor's not a voting member except in the case of a tie, and the mayor doesn't count towards a quorum for purposes of the vote. So 3 voting members of 5. And then if the mayor's not there, and the mayor pro tem is, the mayor pro tem will run the meeting, and if the mayor pro tem's not there, then they'll have to decide between the 3 of them who's going to run the meeting. This keeps the mayor from dictating when a special meeting can be held. Or a regular meeting, for that matter.
Any discussion from the commission? Sounds like the mayor and.
And that's the same as a general law city. The mayor's not part of a quorum in a general law city either. It's not 3 council members and the mayor in the general law city either, sorry. So it's consistent with current practice.
Do I have any further discussion on this issue, or do I have a motion on it?
I move that it be used as written.
With the adjustment to three members, right?
Of three,
Yeah.
yes.
So I have a motion. Do I have a second? Motion and a second. Any further discussion? All those in favor say aye. Any opposed?
Aye.
Motion carried.
Section 3.10, Rules of Procedure and Abstentions. City council shall adopt rules of procedure for its meetings. Gives great flexibility for them to adopt whatever rules they want to adopt, but they have to adopt some rules. B, all members of city council shall vote on all matters before the city council unless state law requires them to abstain. So this is that provision that disallows someone from abstaining on a vote just because they don't want to vote.
Any discussion from the commission or
And
question?
that would prevent them from walking out?
Wouldn't prevent them from walking out. And as a matter of fact, I've got a client where this provision is in their charter, and it's incredible to me how conveniently sometimes someone has to go to the bathroom or get a cup of coffee during a critical vote. But if they're sitting on the dais, they have to vote.
Could you give us an example of where state law would require them to abstain?
Sure. Let me think of a very black and white example. Council member owns, city council goes out for requests for proposals to clean City Hall. They need a new cleaning company. One of the council members owns a cleaning company and responds to that request for proposals. They would have to abstain from participating in the discussion regarding the issuance of that the contract and voting on the contract under state law.
And who's
So
in
conflict of
charge-
interest type of a thing.
Yeah. Mhm.
And so who's in charge of determining whether they have to abstain? Is that-
They are.
They are?
And it's a crime if they don't. They can go to jail.
But
So it's pretty powerful. Unlike many provisions of state law that require certain things that don't have teeth, this one actually has teeth. If they don't comply with the law, which is announce their abstention, file their appropriate paperwork with the city secretary, abstain from discussion, and abstain from vote, that's a crime. And it's a Class B misdemeanor, I think. So, I mean, you can go to jail and you can get fined. So there's a lot of teeth associated with required abstentions.
So if you own a company and you're on the city council, and the city decides that you happen to be the low bidder, they couldn't hire you?
They could. You just could not vote on your own. You couldn't participate in the discussion or vote on it, but they could hire you. Here's where it comes up more often than not. It's not that the city council member owns the company. It's that the city council member's husband or wife is the bookkeeper or works for the company, and they get a substantial portion of their income as defined by the statute from that company, right? That they would still have to abstain from that discussion and vote. That's usually where it comes up.
Thank you.
Any further discussion on section 310?
I have something on the wording of B. It says all members of city council, and if you look back at Article 3 at the front in 301, it defines members of city council as the mayor and council members.
Right. It would prohibit the mayor from voting in case of a tie.
Right.
Yep.
So that language, I mean, it's saying they shall vote on all matters.
Right. And so the mayor would only vote on those matters that he has an obligation to vote, which is when there's a tie.
He wouldn't be able to vote on that one if it was a tie, though.
Correct. That's correct. I think Mr. Willis was questioning whether or not which a legitimate question, whether or not it was the wording was appropriate. And I think the wording captures what we're trying to do here, which is the mayor doesn't always vote, but when the mayor does vote, he has to vote unless there's a legal requirement for him to abstain, or her.
And I don't own a cleaning company, so we should be good to go.
Should be okay.
Should be all right on that one.
So on the part where it talks about unless the law requires them to abstain, should there be is that a given that there's a conflict of interest written where the state law
Yeah,
says
yes,
that?
ma'am. Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, ma'am.
Any more discussion? Do I have a motion on 310?
I make a motion, we approve 310 as written.
I have a motion. Do I have a second?
I second.
Motion and a second. Any further discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries.
Thank you. 3.11, passage of ordinances in general. City council shall legislate by ordinance only, and the enacting clause of every ordinance shall read, be it ordained by the city council. Oh, my gosh. Oh, right, okay, now I forgot. I didn't bring you a new one with Garden Ridge in it. I left it in Fort Stockton. I panicked there for a moment. Be it ordained by the city council of the city of Garden Ridge, Texas. Pretty straightforward boilerplate.
Yeah, that was the three on the
Did I?
redraft.
Oh, on the change, I gave it to you, yes. I was reading it out of the original document. I'm glad I did. Yeah, smarter than I thought. That doesn't happen very often.
So we have a new 311. I think I've lost track.
Right, no, so this is exactly like the old, so if we have a new 311, you've already approved the D, so we'll just be going through A through C.
Do I have any discussion from the commission on A through C?
Did have a question, the previous language, the Fort Stockton language, talked about being published in a newspaper or if it's equivalent.
Yes,
I wondered, I'm not sure what newspaper we'd use or what the equivalent would be, and is that something that's necessary for us?
Any ordinance that has a fine penalty in it, by law, we have to publish it in the newspaper before it is actually enforceable. Right now, as a general law city, we have to publish 2 times. As a home rule city, we would only have to publish once, which will be a cost savings to the city. And our official city newspaper is the Herald Zeitung in New Braunfels.
That's.
And
what
that
my
is
question-
one designation that we have to do annually by resolution at the beginning of the new fiscal year.
by state law.
Yes.
Thank you, answered my question.
Any further discussion on 311 with the revisions that he included?
So if we look at the new 311, let me just read the new 311 because I had forgotten that I had drafted revisions to that. So the new 311 obviously makes the correction of Garden Ridge. B would read, each proposed ordinance shall be introduced in written or printed form required for adoption and shall contain a title or caption that fairly and accurately identifies the subjects or subject addressed in the ordinance. That's some recitation of state law and some not. So state law does require a written ordinance to be placed before city council in order for an ordinance to be adopted. I like putting that in here because a lot of folks don't know that. So I like putting it in the charter because it's not statutory, it's case law. And then it requires that, hey, if we're going to have a caption of the ordinance, it needs to be an accurate recitation of what the subject is. And then finally, C, if a majority of city council present at a city council meeting requests that an ordinance title and caption or the entirety of the ordinance be read, it shall be read. So this is in here, so that some cities actually require that the entire caption of the ordinance be read at the city council meeting. It requires it. That's not required by law, though. By law, you just need to put enough notice in your agenda so that folks know what's going to be debated, discussed, and potentially adopted. So a lot of so most cities will have an agenda item that says, discuss and consider adoption of an ordinance creating a solid waste franchise, period, right? So let's say that's the agenda item. This C would then say that if majority of the city council request it, the title and the caption or the entirety of the ordinance will have to be read at the council meeting itself, more than just the agenda item. That's what this deals with. Do y'all do the captions? You don't, you're not required to. Most cities don't, as a matter of fact. But some cities have home rule charters that actually require the entire caption to be read, which drives mayors crazy because sometimes captions can be this long and it takes 4 minutes to read it, especially bond captions. But the way this is drafted, simple agenda item, discuss and consider adoption of an ordinance adopting a solid waste franchise fee would be sufficient. And then at the meeting, if a council member is concerned, if the majority of council is concerned about an issue, they can require that the full ordinance to be read at the meeting. Require it, but it's not mandatory. Majority of council.
Nancy, and I don't think at the meetings, I've never heard a long,
No, I think
Caption.
the only time I've ever seen it done at another city is when you just have a council person that wants to drag the meeting on and just sort of wear down the opposition.
Make a point.
Yeah, so normally I've just seen the caption read.
yeah.
I mean, what I'm just kind of reading from Nancy and the mayor's face is they would be fine with the ordinance title and caption, but not the entirety of the ordinance. I think they would prefer that not be in there.
But the wording of this says if a majority of the city council requests it, and my thought is if the majority's requested it, there must be something very important that why they're wanting it read.
I think the only ordinances that I can think of that are long and tedious would be, I would not want to read the entire planning and zoning ordinance, 13 aloud.
We currently, our practice here is the ordinance title is the agenda item. And I don't think that, it's a problem to keep that as our process.
And the captions are usually fairly brief as well. I mean, they're not much more generally on
There
this.
occasionally can be an ordinance that might be rather lengthy, the caption be rather lengthy, but most of them, I'd say, were anywhere between 4 to 8 lines long.
Yeah.
I would also say that ordinances are public documents. So if somebody is concerned about specific word within the ordinance, all of that is going to be published on the city's website in the council packet. So anybody could go and read the whole thing at length themselves if they wanted to.
And that's why it would be left with just the title, basically, to keep it simple.
It's up to y'all. Like I say, I guess I've dealt with cities having to read the title and the caption, but the captions are usually short, so it's whatever y'all want to do. I think
And I
this-
apologize, I guess I'm not tracking with the discussion because this paragraph D doesn't look restrictive. It basically, it's not saying you've got to read anything more than the caption. It's only saying that the majority of the council feels it needs to be read, then it would be read. And to me, that's not one person wanting to be a jerk and have a whole planning and zoning ordinance read. If a majority of the council feels something needs to be read out loud, I feel that there must be something important of that majority of why they're wanting it read out loud. So I don't find this wording restrictive or redundant. I think to take that out of there means you're only going to read the agenda topic or the caption, which there may be times this gives the council the ability to require something to be read. I'm missing part of the argument here.
I agree with you, Jim, because the operative words here is if the majority request. So if it comes up, it's here. So I agree with you.
Any more discussion?
On that specifically, but I'm still a little confused, Charlie, on, is that the Fort Stockton paragraph C, where it talks about the newspaper, is that state law, so we do not need to put it in our charter language? Or is it because it is only case law that we should include it in our charter language because the state law does not cover it?
Right, so a couple of things. So if you'll notice, the Fort Stockton language didn't include the mayor's authority to require reconsideration. So C was their way of saying when something is effective. They did, and so when I redrafted it, I did leave out the provision regarding that the penal ordinances be published in the paper. 52013 says, of the local government code, the governing body of a home rule municipality may publish a caption of an adopted ordinance that summarizes the purpose of the ordinance and penalty for violating the ordinance in lieu of a requirement in the municipality's charter that the text of the ordinance be published. So state law allows you just to publish the caption. If the charter of a home rule municipality does not provide for the method of publication, which this would not, the full text of the ordinance or a caption that summarizes the purpose of the ordinance and the penalty for violating the ordinance may be published at least twice in the newspaper. So if we want to narrow it down to once, we should probably leave that language in there, Nancy.
I just want to be clear that the newspaper posting is in the rewritten ordinance that you gave us.
Is it?
It's under D2, the last sentence.
Oh, it is. I am smarter than I thought. Twice. So it's in there, yeah.
It's just been moved.
It's just been moved. All right, golly, I got it right again. Y'all have me doubting myself. So are we good with A being, are we good with 311 as it's been brought forward, I guess is what I'm asking.
Do I have a motion of for the entirety of 311 as basically rewritten and
Oh,
submitted?
I apologize, I interjected myself, I shouldn't have. Y'all were having a debate about the reading of the entirety of or just the caption, and I don't know if we resolved that.
Do I have any preference from the commission about which way you want to handle 311? Do you want it?
I agree with Jim and Diana. I think that language is good.
I'd make a motion to accept that wording as written.
Have a motion. Do I have a second?
Second.
Motion and a second. Any further discussion? All in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Motion carries. That's 311.
312. Authentication, recording, codification, and printing. This is fairly boilerplate stuff. All ordinances and resolutions adopted by the city council shall be authenticated by seal and signature of the person performing the duties of city secretary and numbered consecutively as adopted. They shall be properly indexed and placed in a book kept open for public inspection. That's the only thing I don't know about. In today's digital world, I don't know if we are still placing, the city of Garden Ridge is still keeping a physical book, and if that's, I know most cities, I think, like to do that for purposes of historical purposes, but I've had different conversations with folks about that. It's purely policy consideration. With that, I'll dump it over to the people that it matters to.
We currently are keeping a paper record of the ordinances. We also scan them in, so we have an electronic copy. My personal preference is that we do not make us keep a paper copy, so that in the future, if we wanted to discontinue that, we do have to keep a copy some way or another of every ordinance, every resolution. So right now, we're just basically duplicating the work.
However, in the effect that there is a natural disaster, cyber terrorism, I think it would behoove the city to have a physical paper copy that somebody could walk in and have.
So for the record, there will always be a physical paper copy, always. That's required under the law. It has to be actually in the packet before city council. The mayor's going to have to sign it. And so the question is whether or not those physical paper copies need to be, have to be indexed and kept in a book moving forward, or if they can, be stored in some other fashion, I guess.
But if you didn't have them in a book, how would anyone know where to find them in a disaster, for example?
Yeah, I'm not debating or arguing. I'm just letting everybody know you're always going to have a physical piece of paper, at least for the foreseeable future.
So what he's saying is the paper will continue to exist. How we store that paper is that issue. Do we store it in a truck that's in the back side of the recycle area, or where do we keep it? How do we keep it? Right?
Yep, that's the question.
But I think that the book kept open for public inspection is for those that don't have any other means other than coming here to look at some and inspect something. Not necessarily for natural disaster, but for otherwise.
There's a lot of people who don't have access to the website, so it's just available for those.
And those individuals end up having to come into the city hall and beg and plead to
Yes.
see something.
And there's a book there for public inspection.
Yep.
So Marissa, where do you keep all that stuff now? Is the book on your shelf, or where do we store hard copy records in the city of Gartridge?
The originals of the ordinance are kept in our safe. A copy is then made, and they are put in a binder that are properly indexed. It's not out in the lobby, though, so it's not available just at any time. You can't just walk in and sit down and start reading it. We have binders in our mail room that have the copy of the ordinance in there. The originals are put in the safe.
So if somebody wanted to come in and read those ordinances, would you let them read them, or do they have to file an Open Records Act to see them if they don't have internet access? How does that work?
To treat everyone the same, I would ask them to put in a written request, which is what it triggers the Open Records Act. They wouldn't be charged for them if they were just sitting and they wanted to just sit and read them. They didn't want copies made of it. It's also something that's available on our website, so that gets a little tricky with the Public Information Act and charging people for records that are available electronically. Just really depends on the situation. They would have to put their request in writing just because that's how any request is triggered.
So if they wanted to read them, and I understand you not wanting to index them and keep them in a book, especially if there are other hard copies, could they sit down at a city computer and read them electronically?
The only thing I could think of is if they went to the library and used one of those computers that anyone in the public could use. Otherwise, we don't have any space or any computers here at the city that are not on the city's server that we would allow the general public to use. So they would be, in a sense, using a public computer to access the city's website to look at those.
So in essence, everything is being kept on paper and stored electronically in some fashion so that it is accessible by the public or anyone in the city. Any problem with that? Even in a disaster, then the library has its backup, maybe, or maybe we have our backup, so I don't see a problem with it either.
Well, I think it goes down to accessibility, and so we want to make sure all the citizens have access. And so this seems, as much as I understand the frustration with having to index all these things and
Marissa,
the waste of paper,
how-
but it needs to be, I think it does need to be done still.
How often has it happened where somebody comes in and wants to read the ordinances?
I have never personally heard of anyone doing that.
How often has somebody ever come in to want to read the ordinances in City Hall?
I think the better question is, how often do you have a Public Information Act request for an ordinance?
I don't believe I have ever experienced that in my time here.
Because they're available online, right?
Right,
Yeah.
right.
Yeah, but does that matter, how many people ask? It's just available, period.
But like you said, it's available by public going to the library and using the computer there. I've personally gone there and used it. So anyone can access the library computer without, and I think now more people are more likely to do that rather than walking into an office and doing a written.
So was the discussion that kind of started this based on the wording that's in this draft that says placed in a book and kept open for public inspection? Is that the issue that we've been discussing? Because I think we all have agreed, we maintain electronically and we maintain a hard copy somewhere, it's properly indexed. What we don't, I think what we're trying to avert is having some book that we have to maintain that the public can come in and openly look at. Is that the issue here? Because I'm losing the issue.
That's what I understand it is. So it's really just the last sentence that is under discussion. Because the other has to be done anyway as just part of ordinance
Right.
process.
And you're always gonna keep your originals.
So if we change the wording to say they shall be properly indexed and stored for public inspection, I mean, does that get to what we're trying to eliminate? Is this book? I'm not sure what we're trying to wordsmith here.
Because Marissa, if they did file the Freedom of Information Act and ask to look, it wouldn't have to be in a book, right? You could just,
Right, yeah, you still have to comply with it, regardless of whether or not it says, so this is oftentimes just overkill by the previous folks that did this, right? If someone comes in and requests a copy of all ordinances, or not a copy, to inspect all ordinances, they're entitled to do that, regardless if it's in book form or if it's stored somewhere. They have a right to inspect those ordinances under Texas law. Regardless, this language that says, in a book kept open for public inspection, when I drafted that at their request, I never interpreted that to mean that there has to be a bunch of books up in the hallway that you have to have out there for folks to come look at. You would still have to come in and make a request to see the ordinances. It's just a recitation. They wanted to make clear that whoever with the city secretary knew was, if the citizens want to see a copy of it, they can.
Would you
And in
su-
this case, they wanted them to put it in a book, so it was, for whatever reason, I don't know.
If we struck the entire second paragraph, would we still be in?
You need the
okay.
second sentence?
Second sentence, I'm sorry.
Yeah, that would still be fine. Yes, ma'am.
Do we want to move on A and then tackle B, or you want to do them both together, guys? Let's do them. Jim, what you want to do?
I was gonna say, we're hot on this one.
Okay, let's do it.
Let's get this one
Let's
checked
kill it.
off.
Okay. Do I have a motion with regard to A?
I'll make a motion to adopt the A with just the first sentence and scratching the second sentence of that paragraph.
I have a motion. Do I have a second? I'll second. Motion and a second. Any further discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries.
All right. So the city of Fort Stockton and B, city of Fort Stockton has codified their ordinances. What that means is all of their ordinances have been put into a code of ordinances, like all the statutes of the state of Texas are now they used to be statutes, and so now they're codes. And if you go online, you can find the Texas Local Government Code, the tax code, the government code, all the codes. Currently, the city of Garden Ridge has not codified their ordinances. It does cost money to do it, but Fort Stockton has. And so what that means is that if you're a citizen, or anybody, just now, I went to the city of Fort Stockton's, to the Muni Code for Fort Stockton, and I can look at all their ordinances. I can look at all their ordinances right now, in one place, organized in one place. So what B says for them is that the city council may maintain the codification of ordinances of the city. In other words, it's currently codified, they can continue to maintain it, and then they detail how a codification of an ordinance is dealt with. So essentially, you adopt an ordinance, it has all the legislative findings, it has all the whereas clause, which is the whereas clauses, it has all the sections that deal with, severability and all of those things. And only the substance of the ordinance is codified. So you're not reading all that other stuff, and that's put into a code. If you are not, I would definitely, if you feel like you would like to codify your ordinances in the future, have some language in your charter that makes clear that there's authority to do that. And so I would just, other than changing Fort Stockton and Garden Ridge, I would say that the city council may maintain the ordinance of the city by codification, period. And then everything else, which talks about how it's accomplished. That gives you the flexibility to codify your ordinances in the future if you so choose.
And Marissa, where we are on codification?
We are planning to codify our ordinances. We have already signed an agreement with a company to help us, and we've already paid the first payment. So we're definitely doing that.
So it would read, the city council may codify the ordinances of the city. And then, the codification shall be known and cited as the Garden Ridge City Code, shall be in full force and effect. The caption, descriptive clause, and other formal parts may be omitted without affecting the validity of them. Every general ordinance enacted subsequent to the codification shall be enacted as an amendment to the code. General ordinances shall be deemed to be those ordinances of permanent or continuing nature which affect the residents at large. So that would be general ordinances that are adopted. Copies of the code shall be furnished to the city officers, placed in the city offices, and made available for purchase by the public at a reasonable price to determine by the city council not to exceed the cost of permitted by state law. I will say that section was put in, is not required, and was put in very specifically by the city of Fort Stockton, and it will cost you more money to keep a physical copy of it and then make copies of it. I will also tell you that I can go to any codified provision are you guys going Muni Code or Franklin? Franklin. I think Franklin is the same. Let me go to Franklin. Let me go to some city in Franklin. Oh, sure, now choose to. All right. Yes, you can check the chapter that you want to, check it, and download into a PDF and print it at your leisure and will. So there was a big fight at Fort Stockton about whether or not to include this language. It was a small meeting, and so a small majority required it. But it would be costly to include that language in here. But everything else is pretty common language.
Do I have, that's what I was going to ask.
Yeah, the last
Do y'all want to
sentence.
strike the language that we're going to have to provide copies? Okay. So are there any questions with regard to this, making the changes to accommodate the fact that we're looking toward codification?
Just clarification, Charlie, the way you read that, you said, and I'm down into the weeds here, you said the city council may codify the ordinances. They're not doing the work, they're directing the codification.
Yes, sir.
Or authorizing, it was just
Yeah. Yes, sir.
English 101.
Yeah, I'm happy to, that's a valid point. May authorize the may authorize the codification of ordinances? Is everybody okay with that? Okay.
Are you talking about the very first sentence, like city council may maintain the codification? Because we're skipping all over them.
Yes, so, thank you, Mr. Hawley. So yes, the first sentence says currently says the city council may maintain the codification of ordinances of the city. That was written because Fort Stockton currently has theirs codified. The city of,
process is
yeah,
it's in process.
right, and Garden Ridge is in the process.
Yes.
So at Mr. Sturch's request, the first sentence would read, if it's approved by y'all, the city council may authorize the codification of ordinances of the city. And then the last sentence would be struck and everything else would remain the same.
Do I have a motion to adopt 312B as amended?
So moved.
I have a motion. Do I have a second? Motion and a second. Any further discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, motion carries.
Section 3.13, investigations by city council, A. Notwithstanding the provisions of subsection B, which we will get to, the city council may initiate investigations into the affairs of the city and conduct of any city department, office, or agency, and for this purpose may subpoena witnesses, administer oaths, and take testimony, and require the production of evidence. They may also, by ordinance, provide for a misdemeanor offense for the conduct of a person who fails or refuses to obey a lawful order issued in the exercise of this power as a collective body. B, except for the purposes of inquiries and investigations provided for in subsection A, the council member shall deal with the city officers and employees who are subject to the direction and supervision of the city manager solely through the city manager, and neither the city council nor the member of city council shall give orders to or reprimand any such officer or employee either publicly or privately. That reinforces the previous provisions that we have on prohibition and provides very clearly that city council has the authority to investigate any office, department, individual, subpoena witness. And then the last sentence is in there as a reminder because you have to adopt an ordinance to create that penalty. It can't just be in the charter.
Any discussion on this one? Questions?
Can you tell me who the members of the city council are?
The mayor and all the council members.
And the city council, isn't that the same thing?
Yes. So where would you like me to make a change?
The last sentence there, it says, city council nor members of the city council, like.
Oh, right, yes. That's to be very specific. City council as a body can't do it, neither can individual members of the council.
That's what you're saying.
Any other questions on 313? Do I have a motion relative to 313? Certainly.
All right. We had discussed this a little bit earlier today. Charlie, can you give us an example of this type of investigation?
Sure.
Any specifics?
I'm trying to not to be, too crazy, but say there's floating around the allegation of misconduct by a particular employee, and the council believes that that city manager did not handle that appropriately. They believe that they gave that employee a slide, didn't properly conduct an investigation to determine whether or not wrongdoing occurred. This would give city council the ability to go, yeah, well, we're going to conduct an investigation. We're going to find out whether or not wrongdoing occurred.
Any discussion? Do I have a motion on 313?
Make the motion to accept A and B as written in 313.
Motion, second?
I second.
Motion and a second. Any further discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries. Now,
Great.
Charlie, we're sitting at 7:35,
Yes, ma'am.
and I know that Article 4 is going to be extensive. I'm not sure how you feel about starting that tonight and then waiting almost a whole month before we pick up on it.
Ooh, that's probably a valid point.
Or is there some later sections in here that are fairly innocuous?
Sure, why don't we skip to Article 7, General Provisions? Is that all right with everybody? Because all of this, Article 7 and Article 8 are all going to be, with the exception of maybe 8.05 and even Article 9 are going to be pretty straightforward. We can knock those out.
Okay,
Everybody okay with this?
yes,
Okay.
that sounds great.
All right. Article 7, General Provisions, Severability. If any section of this charter is held invalid by a court of competent jurisdiction, such holding shall not invalidate or impair the validity, force, or effect of any other section or part of this charter. If anybody challenges the charter and some part of it is determined to be unconstitutional or unable to be enforced, it won't affect the rest of it. We need this in here. Highly recommend that we have this in here. It's called severability. You want to just go through the whole thing?
Yeah, let's
Oh, there's just
let's-
7.2 is the only one left, okay.
Yeah, let's just
Yeah.
do 7 as well.
Okay. The gender, so wording is, so 7.2 is just wording interpretation to assist who, if this does go to court, it assists with the court interpretation of words. The gender of the wording throughout the chart, oh, and also it's politically correct. The gender of the wording throughout this charter shall always be interpreted to mean either sex. All singular words shall include the plural, and all plural words shall include the singular. All references to the state law or laws of the state of Texas, however expressed in the charter, shall mean as presently enacted or may be amended or superseded. The use of the word city in this charter means the city of Garden Ridge, and the use of the word charter shall mean this home rule charter.
So do I have any questions, or do I have a motion with regard to Article 7?
I have one question. It's about either sex. And with the way things are going today, that should be any sex.
Oof, that's actually a valid.
I love you guys. I swear, you come. No, y'all are wonderful with the little nits and.
Ask my daughter, she's going to say the answer to that question is yes.
Hey, Charlie, I know this is boilerplate stuff too, but if I were reading the charter, I wouldn't expect to be reading that wording in section 7. I'd be expecting to read that up front at the beginning of a charter, because it's going to apply to the whole rest of the charter. So is that where it's
Happy to move
normally
it.
placed in a charter, or is it
It-
normally placed up front?
It's always placed in the back. But I'm happy to move it.
I won't rock the boat. It's just, again, it's a matter.
I don't disagree with you. Yeah, I don't disagree with you. Whenever I do draft an ordinance, I'm always putting the definitions at the front. I never put the definitions at the back. But for whatever reason, every charter has it at the back for whatever. I don't know why. Yeah, because nobody's ever asked before, I think. But certainly we could move it to Article 1 and then bump all of the articles down.
Do I have,
We need to modify it, given the way the world's gone.
what modify it by moving the whole article forward, or by the sex part? The gender, excuse me, that's probably more
Gender,
socially
yeah,
accepted.
yeah. So, the
any
gender of the
gender.
wording throughout this charter shall always be interpreted to mean any gender.
Any gender, yes.
You know, I think,
that's
I
a
love you
slippery
guys. My daughter's gonna be so happy when I tell her this
Yeah.
time.
So do I have a motion relative to Article 7?
I want to move that we leave it as is, but it was just brought to my attention that any gender versus any sex versus either sex, that still seems to be a little bit of an issue.
I don't know, I'm not smart. I'm too old to have the debate, if I'm being honest. I mean, I'm not too old to have the debate. I'm happy to have the debate, not on this dais. I don't know and understand enough how it works to be able to give the right language.
So So this charter applies to the citizens of Garden Ridge, right? Regardless of our race, creed, color, or whatever.
Right.
So could you not just say it's interpreted to mean any citizen of Garden Ridge? Do we have to specify,
Or just say all
Well,
inclusive?
here's where the debate's coming from, right? It used to be these charters always said his, always, always. It was a male-dominated charter, language, male-dominated language. And so over time, that transitioned to, all right, we're not going to discriminate between male and female when we talk about gender. So we're going to do his or her, and then where we screw something up, and sometimes we'll put her, sometimes we'll put his, sometimes we'll put both, and then we'll put this thing at the end that says, hey, no matter what we use, we're not dictating that it has to be a man or a woman. And so now, obviously, we're moving into this this other area that, so there's other genders other than just male and female. And so the purpose of this would be to sort of take that next evolutionary step to recognize that from the standpoint of language. That's all it's supposed to do.
Could we change that to simply say, to be inclusive?
Sure.
All-inclusive.
I'm happy to word it however, it's not my charter. I'm happy to word it however you want. Yeah.
Okay, I'm a little confused about the gender of the wording throughout this chapter should always be interpreted to what? What?
Be inclusive of all genders is what I just
Ah,
heard.
perfect, okay.
That's what I was thinking.
Well, I'm looking up how many sets of genders there are, okay? And let me tell you, there's more than we could cover. So we need to come up with a word that covers, yeah.
Inclusive of all genders is what was,
Yeah,
I
Yeah.
think Wayne's got beautiful language there.
but I'm telling you, it's
And Janelle,
exhaustive.
you started this, I think.
Can you say to be interpreted to any identifying gender?
sure. Again, I defer to somebody that is smarter than, and I'm not at all trying to be demeaning or critical.
No,
I
I
don't.
agree.
Interpreted to mean any applicable gender for the purpose of inclusivity. Just we include everybody. Here we go. Wouldn't that cover it, Charlie?
Sure. Anything that we've just said will probably cover it. I just need some language voted on.
I think
this is a
you're,
really
What
tough
Autumn said,
topic,
when
'cause
Ms. Flanagan
some
said.
people don't declare any gender, but we don't want to rule them out of this charter.
That's why we could say applicable,
Yeah.
because they determine it, it's applicable to them, okay, great. And in the interest of inclusivity, we're there.
I mean,
would
it is kind of a
cover it.
slippery slope.
I think this is something that people are going to start coming at wording in charters, though. I mean,
I
I
don't
don't
disagree
necessarily
with
see
you.
it happening. What?
I don't disagree with you at all.
Yeah, I don't necessarily see it happening in Garden Ridge in the next soon, but I don't know. You never know.
So why do we have to even approach the gender topic? I think what we're trying to find is, no matter what wording is in here, whether it says his, her, she, me, or it applies to everybody that's a citizen of this city. We don't need, I feel we don't need to go down the gender part of the discussion for exactly that reason. We're gonna start having people peel this thing back and going, well, I'm not that gender. No, but you're a citizen in this city, and this applies to you regardless of whether it says he or she or it or other in this charter, is what think I'm hearing. And, or we just leave it as is and just accept the interpretation of our charter.
I think what Charlie was saying was for legal purposes, if it says he, if it were brought up to a lawsuit at some point and it was not a he, it needs to be addressed in the charter. Is that right, Charlie?
Well, I was just thinking, so I've been drafting these for a long time, and the fact that you're having this conversation is not surprising to me because this conversation comes up every single time. This is actually the first time it's come up with respect to other gender identifications. But what so again, a long time ago, there were a lot of hises in here, right? A lot of, the city council shall appoint a city manager. He shall, right? I mean, that's what it said. And then we slowly moved to his and her. What I have tried to do, and I couldn't remember if I did it in this one or not, so I was going back to read some of the language, is I try to take it out entirely. So if you read section 4.01 city manager, there's not a single his or her in the entire section, because I've tried to draft it in a way that takes out the hises and the hers. So for example, just going back to read it, right, without debating whether it's what you want it in your charter or not. The city council shall, upon approval of the majority of the vote of the city council, appoint a city manager who shall be the chief administrative executive officer of the city and shall be responsible to the city council for the administrative affairs of the city. A long time ago, that would have said, appoint a city manager and he shall be the chief. I mean, literally, that's what it would have said. And so I've tried to take out all the his and hers, and then we include the language at the back to say, hey, if we screwed up somewhere where we've got a his and her, his doesn't mean just him. It means him or her. And now, if we say him, we want to make sure we say him is not him. It's him, her, or what other gender
It goes
identification.
back to Janelle's first thing, just change it to all sexes.
Or just, how about, shall be interpreted to mean all persons? Maybe the word person qualifies all identities.
I don't know if I use
You
his.
could
or
say,
her.
the gender of the wording throughout this charter shall always be interpreted to mean any identification of gender.
Oh, I like that.
Someone who has, in my research here on my phone, is they're not all sexual versus gender. They're not the same thing. So,
Right, that's why we're saying gender, not sex.
yeah, so you're even qualifying it by saying a gender, or you're qualifying it by saying sex. So they're all people. So maybe person is the word that would qualify someone who identifies as that gender or as that sex. I mean,
Could you just leave it as any identification and not put of gender or sex at the end of that?
yeah, just to interpret to mean that person. I mean, that's where when you start defining, that's where you get in trouble, because someone will say, well, you haven't defined me. I'm not
I thought
a
that this was
transgender.
gonna
I
be
go by
pretty easy.
my sexuality. You see what I'm saying? Because it's that convoluted.
Right, except for, in this case, we're not talking about sexuality, we're literally talking about gender. Yeah, gender language. And I think that there's a distinction between those two things.
So what is the commission's pleasure? Do we like Autumn's
Yeah,
wording?
I'm sorry, I thought this would be pretty easy.
Yeah, I did too. but
Nadine,
not the only one.
can we do this? Because Nadine, we're all talking about the exact same thing, and we're talking about how to word it. And so, Janelle, what you brought up is extremely important, and that our job is to protect the city of Garden Ridge through this charter, and that helps to do that. So what I'd like to do is defer with everything that you've heard, Charlie, from the commission. I'd defer to legal counsel to tell us what that needs to say.
I was actually going to say, why don't you this is actually really good. Everybody wants to be as inclusive as possible and make sure we have wording that is appropriate. So let me not spend a lot of time, but a little time of trying to come up with some language that works there. Is that okay with everybody?
That is great.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
Thank
we're
you.
going to leave 7 on hold pending that wording,
Right.
correct?
Yes.
And that brought up another topic. I looked because I'd seen his or her earlier in our discussion, section 305.
Okay.
We have upon his or her death. Do we want to go through and scrub this to get rid of all his and hers? Or is it okay if we leave it, if we make that language?
I certainly would advocate for that, and it wouldn't be that, I mean, it's easy to replace his as her with their, quite honestly. But why don't we I'm happy to go back through what I just did. It'll be a non-substantive change, and so we don't have to bring it back. And then as we move forward, I'm certainly an advocate of of trying to make this as neutral as possible.
That sounds great.
Okay.
Now, it is
All right.
now 7:50.
All right,
You
so
wanna
now we'll move on to 8.01. We can, I don't think this will be nearly as controversial as the last one. Controversial isn't even the right word, because it's not controversial. 8.01, I highly recommend you put in there, all legal process against the city shall be served upon either the city secretary or the city manager. It dictates very clearly who has to be serviced for service of process. 8.02, again, recommend this. All rights, claims, actions, orders, contracts, or legal or administrative proceedings shall continue except as modified pursuant to the provisions of this charter, and in each case shall be maintained, carried on, or dealt with by the city department, office, or agency appropriate under this charter. In other words, we're changing our form of government, but we're not changing anything else unless otherwise modified. 8.03, no property of any kind by whomever owned or held, or by whatever institution, agency, political subdivision, or organization owned or held, whether in trust or by this is all legalese, but it's important, whether in trust or by nonprofit organization or corporation or by foundation or otherwise, except property of the city, shall be exempt in any way from any of the special taxes, charges, levies, and assessments authorized or permitted by this charter for local improvements for the public welfare. That's in there here's the reason why that's in there. Because the Texas legislature doesn't want to do the hard work when it's got lobbyists for certain types of organizations. And throughout state law, it punts the question as to whether or not certain entities should be exempt from certain fees, certain fees, from certain fees. And so it gives city council the discretion to determine whether or not a particular organization should or should not be subject to a particular fee, even though they contribute, I'm getting on a soapbox a little bit, even though they contribute to the cost that the fee has been implemented. And so this charter provision takes that discretion away from city council because our charter says that they are subject to the fees. That was very, very vague, wasn't it? So, for example, drainage fees. Y'all have drainage fees? Okay. So state law allows cities to adopt drainage fees, which helps pay for the cost of drainage infrastructure throughout your community, right? And so typically the way drainage fees are implemented, it's called a utility drainage fee because the drainage is a utility of the city. And usually the way those are implemented is you take the square footage of the building, how much impervious cover it contributes to the area, and when it's built, you charge a fee for that impervious cover to help pay for the cost of the drainage necessary, public drainage necessary to handle the water that now comes off of that property that used to be raw land into the drainage system. State law allows cities to be discriminatory in who they charge that against. I think it actually says nonprofit, they can choose not to have it assessed against nonprofit corporations. And so the nonprofit corporations will come to the city and say, we can't afford to pay the fee, and so we shouldn't have to pay it, and it puts a lot of political pressure on city council to say, okay, nonprofit corporations, you're not gonna have to pay that fee. Of course, what that means is that all the other citizens are gonna bear the cost of that nonprofit corporations not contributing to the system, and so they let them opt out. This charter provision doesn't give city council that discretion anymore. It says they have to pay the fee. So if you want to take that discretion away from city council, we can remove this provision.
What is the general law,
Same. This is new. This is something that, so because this is your charter can dictate, hey, everybody's got to pay a fair price. That's what this section does.
Any questions or concerns on that? Okay.
8.04, I don't, actually, so I guess that, I'm going to defer, I guess, maybe a little bit to city administrator and the mayor, but this section says, in addition to any provisions contained in here, the city council may require any city official, department director, or city employee before entering into his or her duties to execute a good and sufficient bond with a surety company doing business in the state of Texas and approved by the city council. The premium of such bond shall be paid by the city. 2 points, and I don't know if you need to follow up, Nancy. One, this says may, so it, they can do that regardless of whether or not this provision is in your charter. And two, most cities have insurance now. Do you guys have a bond for anything? Yeah, I didn't think so. Yeah. You don't do that anymore, or do you? No, nobody does that anymore. That's old school. So I would recommend that this section 8.4 not be placed in there. That's my recommendation. And then finally.
Be struck.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
I couldn't hear you.
I would recommend that that not be placed in there.
Okay.
And
Marissa,
then-
can you move that up?
I'm going to skip 8.08 because that will take some time. It always does. And we'll come back to it if that's okay. And we'll just get to 8.6. Nothing in the charter is intended to waive the city's governmental immunity from suit and/or damages. You would think that that's obvious, but there's been some cases out there that created problems, so I always recommend that this language be in there.
So do I have a motion with regard to Article 8?
I have a comment or
Okay.
question. Just something from the reading that we did. There was no mention in this model charter about liability insurance for the city council. And I don't know if that's something it was kind of an
Not-
optional thing.
You can certainly put it in there that
Well,
that
we're on the
it's
subject of-
required.
Right, because we're talking about striking this language about the bond, but do we want to have anything in our charter about liability insurance for the council? Just a thought. And
They
maybe-
do, so everybody knows, they do have liability insurance, and there's not a city that I'm aware, city in the state of Texas that I'm aware of that does not have insurance. That includes coverage for individual council members.
So you don't think it's necessary to put anything in here because we...
I mean, unless you think in some future city council, and remember, it's their, city council's decision as to whether or not they insure themselves, and I'm pretty certain there's not a city council in the world that's going to say, yeah, I don't need insurance for my official capacity. I'm certainly capable of covering anything I get sued over. I just don't see it happening ever. And if they do, more power to them.
What would you like, Liz?
I mean, I'm fine, I just thought we should discuss it.
Yeah, okay.
So-
So I would recommend adoption of 801, 802, 803, and 806, and then we'll come back to 805 at some future date.
Do I have a motion to that effect? Do I have a motion?
I move that it should be done that way.
I have a motion. Do I have a second?
A second.
Motion second. Any further discussion? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries.
And if you'll give me 2 minutes, we can get through 9. Article 9, the charter or amendments hereto shall take effect immediately following adoption by the voters as prescribed by law. 9.02, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but essentially says that all offices are going to continue after the adoption of the charter. And then finally, 9.03 says all operations are going to continue after adoption of the charter.
Any discussion? Do I have a motion with regard to Article 9?
I move we accept 9 as written.
I have a motion. Do I have a second?
I'll second.
Motion second. Any further discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries.
I'm done.
And with that, I
Nailed it.
think, Charlie, unless you want to tackle anything else tonight,
Unless y'all want to stick around for a little while longer, but we've nailed it.
I think the next couple of meetings are going to be some toughies in terms of discussion. So I really encourage the commission to read read the material that Charlie provided us on basically the reporting responsibilities and everything of the city manager, and then the IRR. So,
Initiative, referendum, and recall as well. And just briefly, so the things I want you to focus on with the well, a couple things. First is, do you want initiative, referendum, and recall? All right, those are the three, that's the first overall broad question. Second, not necessarily process, but the big thing is the number of qualified voters necessary to execute a petition. What number is correct for purposes of initiating an ordinance, for referring an ordinance, or initiating a recall? What should that number be? And I'll get with Nancy, and we'll get some population registered voter numbers for you so that we can, so that we can have a discussion about what, if you decide to include those in your charter, what is the right number for doing those things? That's the big thing.
yeah, we'll probably, when we get to that issue, that will be one of the first things we do, is we'll get Nancy and Rob to go through those numbers for us. Anything else from the commission at this time?
The only thing I'd add is, I went through Figure 3-1 in Blodgett's book about home rule charters, trying to figure out what we weren't talking about. Because we've got Fort Stockton, what is not in here that's something we should talk about? So when we get done with all of this, at some point we'll need to probably go back through something like this, if not this one. You may have another that you recommend, to make sure that we've covered everything that we need to cover for home rule charter.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so that y'all know, I am trying to bring up things that you need to be considering in these as well, as we go through the process. Even though it's not, like, things that Fort Stockton didn't put in, I'm trying to raise as, hey, you should also consider X, Y, or Z. So I am trying to do that as we go along.
Anything else? Well,
Oh,
with that-
wait, I'm sorry, madam.
go ahead.
And if, as y'all are going through Blodgett's book and you have thoughts about that, it might be good to send those, when they come into your head, send them to the city secretary or to Nancy, so that we can be prepared for them as well.
Okay?
Yeah.
That'd be helpful, because as
Yeah.
I went through this and started to go through it, there
Yeah.
were a lot of questions about, well, I'm not sure that really applies and how it would apply.
Right, yeah. And I'd rather do that as we're going through the process rather than like having to come back and rehash certain things.
Anything else?
Nadine, can I say something?
Certainly.
There's 3 meetings under our belt. You guys have done a great job, some wonderful discussions and extremely valid points. And I've enjoyed it. So thanks for saying yes again. And on behalf of the city of Garden Ridge, Merry Christmas, Happy New Year. See you on the 9th, Monday the 9th.
Which is a great segue to
Great
item
segue.
B. Date time of the next meeting is Monday, January 9th at 6 PM. Item number 5, citizen comments. Any citizens to comment? I see none. With that, we're on to item 6, adjournment. Do I have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Have a motion, I have a second. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed, motion carries. We are adjourned, and Merry Christmas to all of you. Great catch, by the way, with the list of topics we haven't covered. That's great. Yeah, no, that's great, Wayne. Yeah.
I'm comfortable talking about the things that were brought up.
You bet, man.
Exactly. No, that's great.
So let me tell you what we've